This panel is about fleet operations, the challenges of, and there's going to be a lot of challenges both in terms of operations and financing and management generally. So to lead this panel, we have Doug Davenport of Prospect Silicon Valley, an innovation hub, a social impact hub based in Silicon Valley, has a facility that helps startups. Doug, why don't you take it from here?
Sure. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm Doug Davenport. Thank you all for being here. I got the thumbs up from Paul. Welcome. Again, Howard really kind of did my work for me in terms of introducing Prospect Silicon Valley. We're really interested in fleets for a couple of major reasons. One, I think they're going to be a major driving force for electrification, and that's only going to change everything behind it. And also because of the fact that when we think about the overall environmental impact of transportation, it is a tremendous fraction of our overall greenhouse gas footprint in the state of California and in general. And we think that fleets are going to be a major driving force for decarbonization, which is a good thing. So the challenge in fleets is that everything is changing all at once. And, we're seeing fleets becoming increasingly electrified. As Howard mentioned, they're going to be running 24/7. The very definition of what a fleet is and who uses or engages that fleet is changing as well. And the way that the vehicles are being purchased or financed or maintained is also changing. So that and 100 other things. So, I'm very pleased that we have three experts from different pieces of the spectrum, and we have a chance to have a conversation about kind of their viewpoints on what's going to be happening. We have Jessica Robinson from Assembly Ventures. You raise your hand, say hi. Kat Dransfield from the emerging mobility company Local Motors. And Paul Breslow of EDF, the French energy utility. So we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to start with Jessica and then move to Kat and then to Paul. Just so you can make some opening comments about this market. And Jessica, really interested in your perspective on what's happening overall as a member of Assembly Ventures.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Doug. Really glad to be here today, subbing in for my partner in Berlin, Felix Schäufelin, who sends his regards. I love fleets within mobility. It's actually how I got my start at Zipcar, which was a very early mobility as a service company that was willing to carry all those vehicles on our books to try and demonstrate a new business model. So it's near and dear to my heart, and certainly an area of opportunity at Assembly as we think about the future of movement across both North America and Europe. I think as we thought about this discussion today, it's important to remember all of the different sorts of fleets that we're looking at. Of course, from a light duty or passenger perspective, there's all of the corporate take-home vehicles, there's the rental car fleets, there's emerging mobility as a service fleets, there's the micro-mobility fleets. Let alone trucking and cargo, when you think about LTL and of course full truckload, where there's hundreds of thousands of individual carriers. You move to rail, there's fleets there, maritime, and of course aviation. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is we often wonder whether there are learnings from one subsector of this industry that can be applied to another. For instance, digital twinning, right? Aviation has really paved the way there. And how does that move back into other land-based fleets? But I do think, Howard, you're framing here around everything is changing all at once, including financing is really important here. The infrastructure is changing. We do not have the luxury in many cases for these fleets of reinventing a new mode where these vehicles are operating. So we're retrofitting in many cases what's already out there. The vehicle design themselves is changing with a focus on different duty cycles than maybe have been rolled out before. Business models are changing, right? You've got a company like Local Motors that's saying, we're going to enter the market fresh. You have incumbents that are saying, oh boy, we have to figure out how to change. And then, of course, how are we going to create revenue and finance all of it? The thing I love most about fleets is the potential for scale. So unlike the consumer space, while the sales cycles might be a little longer and harder, if we get this right, the potential for impact and, of course, driving value within the business is quite great. So, Doug, I'll pause there and certainly glad to dig into any of those areas in my further comments.
Lovely. Thank you. Kat Dransfield, Local Motors. Tell everybody about Local Motors, and also, please share your thoughts on what's happening in fleets and why you're excited about it.
Yeah, sure. So Locals is a Series D company that designs, manufactures, and deploys an electric autonomous vehicle called Ollie for shared use. And so one of the most interesting trends, I think we're seeing in mobility right now is the movement towards personalization and customization, from insurance products all the way through the vehicle experience. When we go and talk to our customers, they want to know how we're going to customize the vehicle for their specific use case and their specific riders. And so I think, this is creating new value streams and technology partners. However, transportation, especially public transportation, isn't really set up to support these types of ecosystems. So I think, as Jessica alluded to, this is amplified by the fact that in transportation, singular decisions tend to be distributed and not easily measured, which serves as kind of a deterrent from investment in new tech. And then on top of that, you've got regulation that wasn't built with autonomy or even really electrification in mind. So, a great example of this is auditability of non-deterministic models that are starting to be used in autonomy and insurance products. Regulators just have no idea how to cope with some of the new technological approaches that we're seeing in fleet management. And the development of the vehicles themselves. So high level, I think the challenges are really around incentives and then evolving the regulatory frameworks in such a way that data is treated like a core asset as opposed to systems being a core asset. So then, where is the opportunity? I think there's a ton to be done around real-time risk and performance quantification. So, a bus driving in autonomous mode when it's 62 degrees and sunny on Tuesday is intrinsically more safe than a bus driving on Wednesday when it's 32 degrees and raining. So, this is a really, really oversimplified example, but I think the ability to parameterize operations in such a way that allows you to make calculated decisions about safety and performance by tweaking routing, occupancy, vehicle speed, whatever the case may be, I think is going to be really game changing, and is going to be a way that allows transportation organizations to see ROI. So secondly, I see a tremendous amount of opportunity in automotive DevOps. So, I think in 2020, Google released, 4 million builds a day. Automotive is trending in that direction as these vehicles become more software. And right now, to be quite honest, we don't really have the tools for code development, versioning, and rollback. Tesla's made a lot of progress on that, but that hasn't really been realized by the rest of the industry. And finally, and I don't think I have the answer to this, but we need new business models around infrastructure and data pipelines. So Ollie, our autonomous vehicle, generates about 1 terabyte of data a day. So you can imagine the amount of connectivity, compute, and storage you need when you start talking about fleets of these vehicles. So data aside, I think, other parts of the infrastructure are very expensive as well. Cellular, wireless charging stations, VX units, these are all major capital investments for transit authorities who are used to just being cost managers and acting like cost managers and culturally being cost managers. So I think, we need to find ways to make these investments more palatable and find efficiencies of scale where we can, to Jessica's point about some of this being relevant across different sectors. So, in closing, I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in this idea of personalization and customization of mobility, but in certain areas, we just need regulation to catch up, and we need the business models to make it happen.
Great. About 100 follow-up questions already. Paul, EDF, with all this change, how does an energy company think about this, and how do you start to intersect with mobility?
Great, thanks, Doug. So I'm part of our R&D group here. EDF Group is one of the world's largest power companies in the US. We're mostly a renewables group, as well as a large energy retailer and trading operation. And I think mobility is definitely one of the hottest topics for all of the utility and the integrated energy companies. We ourselves, as the distribution operator for the country of France, operate the largest electric fleet. One of our new stated goals is to be the largest provider of EV charging in Europe. We've made acquisitions and investments both in the US and in Europe, including EV charging here and aspects like parking and ticketing over in Europe. And I think for us, a lot of people make the assumption with the big trends being electrification and decarbonization that of course the vehicles will be green or somehow decarbonized, but that's really a challenge because what we're talking about is power, not necessarily energy. And so to be able to do that, that means, are we going to plug in our vehicles while the sun is shining only or something like that? And I remember when I started, one of my colleagues made a crazy comment. He said, well, maybe Paul, in the future, all of the cars will drive out to the desert and charge their batteries for the day and come back. And that was one of those things that got me really thinking about the intersection of transportation and energy. And for me personally, I come from more of a decentralized background, so really in the solar business. And I think those types of trends overall, when we talk about digitization and decentralization in the energy space, some of those same themes I think really apply to the transportation space, although we're taking a much more discrete object of the electron or the kilowatt hour and trying to do it in people and packages and things like that. So I think there's a lot of analogies. So for instance, like we have transmission and distribution in the energy space. Of course, we have transport from long distance, long haul, and the local and last mile type of distribution. And I think that same trend of centralization and decentralization we see here, and so a lot of analogies. And I think one of the things I think is most interesting is in the energy space, a lot of us are focused on the concept of flexibility and understanding our system, what the capacity is that system, and being able to optimize kind of supply and demand of it. And so in the same way, I think, you're talking about real time and what is that, the time of use pricing and those types of things. And I think one of the other aspects that's really important is really understanding what the problem is. So a lot of us here in California have realized the problem is sometimes the electricity provider can't actually produce power. In the same way, you can't necessarily have the right product that you need. I had to go sell my Mitsubishi Outlander recently that I loved because it was powering my house during the blackouts because it was not able to tow, enough load. And so anybody who's listening wants to start a startup, I think there's a hole in the market there. And one of the topics I'm really excited about talking about is micromobility. Going back to that decentralized theme, I think it's what is that right product at the right time, thinking about it really four-dimensionally.
That's really interesting. So I'm going to bring up a topic of kind of, where the limits are, right? And so I've heard a couple of things in these comments, and I think, you all would agree that there's actually a number of kind of limiters out there that we're all working on. So if fleets are moving toward, an increasing number of electric vehicles, if fleets are becoming increasingly independent and decentralized, if they're also kind of taking on new forms, there's a couple of things that happen, right? So Jessica, you said infrastructure, major issue, right? Paul, you just said power and fueling, and the fuel switch that we're seeing is going to be another major issue. Kat, you said regulations are going to be a major issue. And isn't it true that it's kind of, from wherever you're sitting, you're seeing kind of the long pole in the tent that you have to deal with, right? I guess I'd love to kind of go back to those limitations from your perspective, and what you think it's going to take to kind of pull that back. I'd add one more, by the way, and that's just the fact that the people that are used to buying whatever they're buying, and I'm talking about conventional fleets here. I'm not talking about flying car fleets and everything else where maybe the game can change, but conventional buyers are tending to be kind of a subsistence level mentality when it comes to managing a fleet. This car is broken, I can no longer fix it, therefore I'm changing, or it's kind of beyond its useful life, so I'm going to replace it. And there's an utter disconnect between their kind of procurement process and their goals, and they're often completely unequipped to even buy what they need to buy, nor do they understand where all these limiters are. So again, if we can just kind of go through, informally here, your perspective on what you see as the biggest limitation to kind of a completely kind of, global picture here for the kinds of fleets that we're talking about, and maybe further comment on that, it would be great. So Jessica, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, I can take a swing at that one. And I love the fact that you brought up the purchasing habits. Certainly, the shift from CapEx to OpEx within public transit, of course, we know that those vehicles are funded in a certain way today, and that fundamentally informs those purchasing decisions. But there's other human elements to that too, where if it's a non-revenue vehicle or a company car, there's a custom related to being able to taking that car home at night. And, maybe that's not on the table anymore when you shift to a different purchasing structure or an as a service model. So when you peel the layers back, it does start to get interesting. I do want to hit on the idea of infrastructure and decentralization together, because I do think that there are some hairy things to pull apart there, in the sense that within fleets, there's an efficiency to be had if you can drive charging density with a high quality of power at a depot. Yet, if we're moving to decentralized fleets and or more flexible fleets, how might we build that infrastructure out to support those electrified vehicles? And we certainly are seeing all sorts of points of view where gas stations still want to be involved to maintain their toehold in the market. The packaged good delivery type entities already have these depots at their distribution centers, and they're thinking about using them there. And we already, as bare bones it is in the US, we do have a consumer-facing charging network. And what does it look like to upgrade that for various types of vehicles? I think, Paul, I'd be really interested in your perspective here from a utility provider. obviously the opportunity is around selling electrons, but there's an Accenture study I'm just a huge fan of that outlines it's like $1.5 trillion just in selling electricity in the US and Europe. But all of those other services, the grid flexibility and the add-on, huge potential upside for utilities. But that's an industry that's not necessarily known for moving quickly, and you're already capital intensive building new energy production sites. I guess I'll pause there. Other than I don't have an answer, but I do think it's one of those areas that we should be mindful and thoughtful about. And it extends beyond electrification. Hydrogen, it's the same set of questions around distribution network.
I know this is just a vastly broad topic. We could have literally an entire day on just one of these subtopics. We could talk about it forever. But Paul, why don't we kind of go to you? With regards to that, and plus your own thoughts on limitations. What's going to happen in terms of electricity demand, for example, much less hydrogen or other fueling. What kind of shift are we really up for? And what's your viewpoint toward how that's going to impact your utility?
Yeah, well, definitely to take off from where Jessica was saying with infrastructure, I think it's hugely important. And one of the frameworks that I really like for analysis is the PESTLE framework. Thinking about what are the political aspects, the economic, the environmental, the social, the technological, and the regulatory. And a lot of those, I think, are really regulatory barriers. But one of the things which I think we've done a nice job of in this country, and especially certain places, is having those sort of market transformation incentives from regulatory side, having really aggressive companies, which may break some things as they're going along, but they're pushing forward. And so we have to bootstrap our way towards this better future. And it may be innovation on the regulatory side that's bringing the market kicking and screaming, or on the market side or on the social side. And I think when it comes to infrastructure, obviously Europe has a different approach than we do for the most part in the US, and we're starting to build out charging networks on both sides. And you can ask the question of, is it the right business model? And even in California, the utilities have different sort of approaches they've taken with the regulators in terms of, where their build out allows them to go. And so that same I guess, variation in terms of what the infrastructure build out and who pays for that infrastructure is going to probably continue across the globe. And I think one of the things that I'm really challenged by is the concept of Band-Aid technologies, because I think the customer need, they don't necessarily know what exactly they need and what the right technology is to fit that. And we're still getting there towards what may be some, multimodal or different size of vehicles, autonomous future. And so by building out networks of charging that serve today's technology, I worry about the risk of the future. And our gas station is going to be the right place for, that single family vehicle that's still owned in 10 or 20 years. I'm not sure. But I think probably the thing that interests me most about it is really going back to the combination of the business models, because I think a lot of the cities have had business models predicated on a lot of revenue from transportation. And as that shifts, then the question is, well, okay, as we have fleets that are growing, who owns those fleets? What are the revenues from those? They're concession business models. So, one of our major business models is a concession-based business model where, we do what we need to and we make a return on investment. And that's pretty common in the utility space. And so I'm really interested in seeing how the cities respond over time. I think micromobility has been an interesting, view into that, because, first they accept it and it's open, and then they reject it, and then they want some other type of business aspect. And so, it comes to the powering of these, it's definitely going to be a challenge. But I think what's really most important is for us to think thoughtfully and work together on what exactly the problem is we're trying to solve and how that evolves over time. And then having an acceptable conversation about how to pay for that. Because I think at the end, it is incumbent upon us to think about what the fair payment is for that. And I think a lot of people are wondering about that in transportation. The energy space, it is a huge industry. And, there are economics that are generally pretty solid. In the transportation space, as I've been learning more and more, the economics often aren't there, especially for public infrastructure. And I think there are opportunities with new modes like micromobility, perhaps be able to do that because you have a much lower fundamental cost structure.
Got it. And I want to come back to some of your thoughts in a second. Kat, you had kind of pointed to regulations, and I'm guessing that's because you're a young, rapidly growing mobility company of your own that's literally building your own vehicles and wanting to provide services, and you're seeing that as one of the things kind of holding you back, so to speak. I'm going to be gentle with those words. Just wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit more about that, and maybe if there's other things that you think are really necessary for the kind of direction that your company wants to head.
Yeah, so I think very tactically, I started my career in government, and what I used to say when I was trying to work with young, more innovative companies, the name of the game from a contracting perspective was always to find a way to make them a second-tier supplier as opposed to a prime. Because if you can get them out of, being a prime contractor where you have very prescriptive requirements about auditability, for example, accounting, timekeeping, those types of things that small innovative companies are very bad at or can't do for a lot of reasons. If you can get them categorized as a supplier, you can be much more nimble. And so I think, what we're seeing in this strategy, we at Locomotors have had a lot of success with is these boutique fleet integrators are starting to pop up. Beat in Florida being a great example, Keolis in Europe, these groups who specialize in basically just being a pass-through for government contracts so that government can work more efficiently with small companies. So I think, that's one trend we're seeing, and, we'll see more long-term as regulation, starts to catch up, whether or not those groups, how those groups evolve. So I think that's one thing. And then I think, the other thing is, I've always believed that government learns by doing. And so, Doug, I think the DOT grant that we're on together with SCVTA is a great example. In the case of that grant, we're looking at ADA regulations and using DOT grant money to basically influence the trajectory of ADA in the future, because 50% of ADA says a driver has to do something. And so, that's a great example of places where we can, instruct and influence by doing together.
Right. I think that's really cool. So Paul and Jessica, and I want to pick up a question that our dear organizer has asked that I think is really important. So I want to bring this back to the perspective of a fleet owner. I'm just going to tell you a story about Kat and my dear friend, the VTA, Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority. So they're just one regional bus organization. They have about 500 buses. And if they're going to electrify that entire bus fleet and run services on electric buses, it's for the power that they need. It's the equivalent of just suddenly dropping an entire neighborhood into one location in the city, the size of a bus yard. And we're talking about massive amounts of power that are needed. So that's going to be replicated across transit agencies, public sector fleets, which are incredibly diverse in and of themselves, delivery fleets, micromobility fleets, and a lot of other things. So Paul, starting with you, what does that mean for utilities? What are the new business models that come from the fact that there's a lot more power needed, there's a lot more infrastructure needed, much less the regulations that are going to help kind of redefine how we can operate. What does that mean for a utility in terms of business and new business you might get into?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think maybe going back to something that Kat said earlier, the software being an issue. We're in the business of, for the most part, developing, building, owning, and operating hardware. And the software aspect is still a very relatively new part of what we're doing, and the optimization and trying to find how we can, flex that system, the capacity in it. And one of the things I think is really important, again, from a conceptual framework perspective, is the aspect of four-dimensionality. And it's really kind of where, from a geographic perspective, and then often from a time perspective, are we able to really optimize the system? And, for one bus fleet to go, install, a charging system and to do all the upgrades necessary to get megawatts of power in there, that's something which we can do. But a lot of times we're looking to avoid some of those upgrade costs, because again, you have costs that may be shifted, perhaps all to the customer side, maybe to that fleet operator, or to towards the society at all. And I think the other aspect from a fleet perspective generally is we operate fleets of power generation. We operate fleets of batteries. So in terms of business models in France, one of the new aspects that we've been in the last few years, and some people probably even have done it personally, is you rent your vehicle or you lease your vehicle, and then you also lease the battery. And that helps to decouple the two. And I think that type of model is interesting. We see the same thing with micromobility and with vehicles, and we're active with battery swapping in China with our team there. And so, when you think about what the solution is, when I have my own EV charger at my house, which is being used 10% of the time, you take that same concept, that same story, and you replicate it at a higher one, and you can start to see where it really makes sense if we understand what that fleet need is overall. I think it's been some interesting growth in some of the startups that are trying to help the fleet to electrify, to understand that. I know you've got some that are working with you, and that's one of the great things that Prospect Silicon Valley does, is identify some of those cutting edge areas and work with the startups to be able to, to prove out their technologies. And so I think there's the battery aspect interesting, the software, trying to identify it, and then thinking more holistically as, a city or a community, what are the problems we're really trying to solve?
That's great. Jessica, I'd love your thoughts on this as well. We just have a few minutes. And by the way, anybody in the audience that might have a question, please post it and we'll get to it. Jessica, same question to you when you're looking at it from your kind of viewpoint as a VC. Where do you think new lines of business are going to form around the fact that a massive amount of energy is going to be needed and distributed in order for this to all kind of move forward?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question, in part because I think the one of the things that I love about fleets is those fleet managers, whoever ultimately owns that as a cost center or the cogs within the service, is he or she is hyper aware of the cost of running that fleet, unlike a consumer who we're all frankly quite lazy about cost of ownership. So the economics in theory are aligned, but I think one of the interesting considerations is that within fleets, a lot of times the number one metric or the holy grail is utilization. And can you drive toward, near perfect or 100% utilization? when you think about layering in an electrified powertrain, your local utility will say, of course, you can't actually achieve 100% utilization or drive time. So when are you charging? There are absolutely times a day where the utility would be devastated if you plugged in your fleet of vehicles. And that may not at all line up with the way your business works, whether you're the transit system or package delivery or the rental car company. And so the temporal element, I think, is really a fascinating piece. And there's a ton of opportunity within that. I mean, we see that kind of grid flexibility, people trying to tackle it at the vehicle level, make the vehicle smart. People are trying to tackle it at the charging station level. They're trying to tackle it in the box that connects to the grid, and then the grid itself. So I think that there's a lot of alignment and understanding that that's an important element, but no clear winners there yet. I also really appreciated the comment around swappable batteries. Obviously, in automotive in the US, we have a history there of wondering whether that will work. But our team recently wrote about both NEO and Gogoro and scooters, looking at battery swapping. And maybe it doesn't, Doug, solve your VTA challenge for charging off-site and then transporting fully charged batteries in. Of course, there's some safety considerations around that too. But for smaller batteries, that is theoretically very possible. And so I think we're going to see optimization across battery size as well. And then the last thing I'll say is again, the financing within that. Might a utility in the US, as part of its non-regulated business, actually get into battery financing? Totally possible. And someday, if that's a business model that evolves, can some of that be securitized, right? As an asset, how it amortizes down over time, and it actually becomes a financial instrument. All of that's possible, but it takes a lot to get there.
Well, so a very wise audience member for whom I personally have a lot of respect asked a question, and I'm going to kind of frame it real quickly, just in terms of our friend VTA, the single transit authority, of which there are many, many, many just in the state of California, much less the world. That 500 bus fleet represents, believe it or not, if they were all fully charged sitting in the yard, that's 100 million kilowatt hours of energy. All right, that's one fleet, right? That ought to change the way utilities see mobility companies, because now the equation of who's got dispatchable power is just a completely different story. Maybe Paul, you can kick off a quick comment, and maybe the other our other two panelists might have a thought on this. How do you think about mobility providers when they carry that much capacity in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. None of us have mentioned, I think, the phrase particularly about vehicle to grid, but obviously that's what you're bringing up, and I think it's definitely an opportunity. It's one which really hasn't presented itself yet, just because of a lot of the regulation aspects and some of the technological aspects and just the vehicles and their ability to and being able to integrate that. But it is coming. We made an investment in a vehicle to grid company here in the US and are active in Europe, providing different types of services there. But then the market for those services have to make sense. And so I think, again, when we think about the problem holistically, of the energy problem and the transportation problem, and we look for the combined, it's definitely an aspect where you can have some real 1 + 1 = 3 synergy. But it is also the case that every time that you dispatch that battery for power instead of for transportation, then you're using it. And then what is the value of that? And then what are the warranty aspects of that? And who owns that? Going back to what Jessica said, we may, as the energy company, have a battery leasing offering. And if we're doing that, and we're then both producing the energy for the transportation and for the power system, that could be done. But I think it goes back to aligning those incentives and making sure that all the participants are interested in doing it. But I'll go back also to what Jessica said, is that the temporal aspect. Because there's many times during the day, as we know, when we're producing so much power that the cost of that power actually starts to go negative. And it's happening more and more with renewables. And so, we think about both the technical aspect and the economic aspect, you start to see more and more what that synergy could be. And then, what's interesting is a lot of times the transportation, peaks in the morning and it peaks kind of in the evening time. And that is the opposite of when solar would be shining. So there is probably a strong opportunity. And then again, we start thinking about what the economics are for solar as its own part for being able to do power. A lot of people are starting to think you can build more and more and overbuild, and it's okay because that marginal amount that you build to overbuild that you might curtail or lose is not really hurting the economics too much. And so if you can do that and overbuild, and then at the same time be able to absorb that, with another system, the co-optimization of those systems, I think we've really got some good opportunities. But we have to have all those industries and regulators at the table to be able to co-optimize that.
Got it. Really appreciate that. Just thoughts, Kat, Jessica, and do you think transit's going to be leading the way, or do you think logistics could lead the way on this? Who's gonna build more?
Oh boy, that went in.
Yeah, just
totally
come on, just tell
direction.
us.
Oh my goodness. No, I was gonna say, I think, oh man. My first comment was actually going to be around energy use within buildings. There's been a lot of success recently, in the past 15 years around getting buildings to pre-cool or preheat and shifting some of that temporal load. The challenge, I think, as we shift to electrified fleets with those peaky demand is there's no demand signal to the utility until you plug the thing in. And I actually was thinking I would love to know for consumer vehicles and even fleet vehicles, what the average fuel level actually is on a day-to-day basis, because there's so much talk about range anxiety and dragging it down. I mean, I'm always that person that's at like 2% battery on my phone, and then I plug in. I don't plug it in when it's at 60%. Come on. But can someone incent me to charge when I'm at 60% versus the human element? Private versus public. There's a lot of certainly money coming from the federal government in the US and Europe. I think there's a chance to be moral leaders here. Ultimately, I think the private sector will lead though.
Thanks. Last word, Kat?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think, the other lever we can pull in this whole fleet arrangement, if I put on my technical sales hat, what I would tell you is Santa Clara VTA, you don't need 500 vehicles. You need 300 purpose-built, multi-use case vehicles. And, a great example of that is, we're talking to Bainbridge Island up in Seattle right now, and they want us to do grocery delivery in one direction and people transport in the other, right? In a typical fleet model, that's two different vehicles. All I need to do is put RFID code lockers on the QR code lockers on the outside of our vehicle, and boom, I'm doing two things at once. And so I think, as we see more sort of agile hardware development in vehicles themselves, I think we're going to be able to offset a little bit of this by building vehicles in a much smarter way.
All right. Thank you all. We're going to get the hook here. Kat, Paul, Jessica, this has been a great conversation. Howard, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the panel and to you, Doug. It's been a terrific conversation.